Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Ecomos Philippines and also especially Tina for giving me this opportunity to speak in this important conference that you are holding, where you are discussing the impact of development projects on cultural heritage. So, in my presentation, which I'm going to share now, I will be speaking about the importance of considering risk management in planning and decision making. Because when we think about all the development projects, we should also think about their impacts on disaster risks. And I'm going to share through some of my personal examples through collected through experience to illustrate how important it is to think about the impact of development projects on disaster risks. So let me start by explaining to you one of the major disasters that happened in India in 2013, and these were flash floods that affected the state of Uttarakhand in northern India, which is actually located in the Himalayan region. Now, of course, this heavy rainfall that took place in the peak summer month, a bit before the monsoon season. So it was not really very much according to the usual season when the rains come in. And so the temperatures were very high. And as the water came from heavy rainfall, there was also water coming from the melting glacier because the glacier was already kind of melting, but because of high temperature, a large amount of water from that glacier came down along with the heavy rains. And so, with this huge amount of water, the river had to find a way to spread this water around. But a lot of developments that had taken place along the river were not in the right area. They were in the floodplain areas. And so these are the areas where they were not supposed to be built upon, because this is where water would find its way in case of heavy rains. And but since there was no way for water to spread around, a lot of these structures, which in fact were developed as tourism infrastructure for visitors who were coming to visit many of the religious shrines, and many of them were of very high heritage significance. And because of lack of consideration of this tourism infrastructure along the river, water kind of didn't find its way, and also water coming down the hill from this melted glacier was also carrying with it a lot of silt. And so that silt also kind of got deposited, and you can see here that one of the important shrines was half buried because of the silt that was carried down by the water. Now, also, there were some embankments that were constructed along the river, just to control the water from spreading around, again, to direct the flow of water. But when such a huge amount of water came in with a lot of pressure, many of these embankments actually broke. And because of the breaking of these embankments, a lot of heritage structures which were located uh, right next to them also got damaged. So one can really understand how these development projects, which are not considering the safe location, which are not considering the fact that water needs to find its way, and you can't just restrict the flow of water, were actually creating a lot more damage, and of course, combined with climate change impacts. And so you can see that another important thing that happened was erosion, and also there were a lot of landslides that happened. Now, this was also because of cutting down of trees, because of the deforestation. Many of these areas had the soil had become very loose, and of course, landslides took place. And also another thing to keep in mind is that traditionally, in fact, these settlements were not built down the slope. They were actually built on the higher slopes of the mountains. But then gradually people lost this traditional wisdom, and as they started to build along the river, one could see that many of these settlements were coming down in areas which were not supposed to be built upon, and created a lot more disaster risks. Now, another thing that I would like to also mention is how urbanization, when it doesn't consider the local water system, the local hydrology, sometimes actually create disaster risks. And many of our historic urban areas, and I'm giving example of Bangalore here, which had a very distinct, which was designed according to local hydrology with a lot of lakes and canals that were connected to each other and feeding each other. But the new development didn't respect, and many of these lakes, which had fresh water coming in, became like pools with stagnant water. And in fact, many of those heritage structures, as you can see on the left side, couldn't function as that they were intended to perform. And so a lot of sewage was being dumped there, and also that created a lot of pollution, a lot of other kind of unimaginable risks like fire, because of the gases getting accumulated in this. So one can then again see that lack of respect of the traditional planning system, traditional hydrology, and the new developments sometimes create these kind of disaster risks also, because probably they were not really considering these parameters, which are so important. Now, I would come to the third example of a river island in the northeast of India. And again, this was an important island with many monasteries and a very distinct kind of ecosystem, local flora and fauna. And but over the years, this has been disintegrating, and a lot of erosion was seen, and this was getting kind of cut into small pieces of islands. So why this increased pace of erosion was happening, and why was this island breaking up? Well, one of the reason was that a dam was being constructed uphill, and that dam started to divert a large amount of water towards this island. And because of this flow of water coming in, it started cutting the shores of the island, and it started to lead to much more increased erosion. And that was one of the reasons why this was happening. Of course, it was also happening because many of the traditional methods of protecting the islands were being abandoned. So here you can see that one of the traditional ways of managing floods was to retain the silt from the river, not by creating an embankment, but actually creating these kind of wooden retaining logs, which would kind of contain the silt. And then people would actually use the silt because it was very clay in its properties, and this was used to make pottery. So it was also connected to the livelihoods of the people. So you can see that the flood mitigation measure is also connected to the economic life of the people and was sustaining them in a way. So again, a lot of lessons to learn from. Also, in terms of the architecture, they were using bamboo and stilt houses. Uh, and this was for the simple reason, and you would find them in many parts of Southeast Asia as well. And the reason was because they would accept floods as part of their daily life. And so the design was in line with that understanding. Also, bamboo houses could be easily dismantled and moved, because if this area also had a traditional undulating topography which would change every year depending on the flow of water. And so if the house would find itself in the low-lying area, they will be moving, the residents will move them to the other area. So in a way, this was like a shifting settlement. And this was very much embedded in the way the whole traditional planning system had evolved. But then another important thing to keep in mind is that this is a highly earthquake prone area. And so bamboo is a very good material from that point of view. But then they started to replace bamboo with concrete. and concrete, of course, was considered as a symbol of development, but of course retaining the form, traditional form. But then with this new form, using concrete, it would in fact increase the vulnerability, because you create soft stories in this kind of with new material being used. And also, as I said, there was topography of this area would change regularly, and so it was very easy to connect areas through these kind of walkways that were made using local material. But then and then they would be always moved according to the changed topography. So if but then again, in the name of new development, flyovers started to get constructed, and many of the traditional houses were being replaced by these concrete RCC structures, and it was not possible to move them anymore. And so these structures would sometimes find themselves in low-lying areas and getting flooded. So again, the question is that even when you do development, are you taking into account the traditional ways of living with disasters sometimes? And often in the name of risk mitigation or preparedness, you actually start to increase the vulnerability in the long run. And then again, there were many monasteries in this island, and they had very important manuscripts of high historic value, and they were getting flooded, and the manuscripts were getting damaged. Again, you can see that how all this new development has impact on different attributes of heritage, from the natural components to the traditional housing to these important historic documents that were being affected because of the increased instances of flooding. So that's these three examples I wanted to show you, to be able to emphasize on the importance of place-based approach for heritage management, because that is the key to reduce disaster risk. So what do we mean by place-based approach? That simply means that we can't look at heritage sites in isolation only by considering the boundaries of these sites, but we need to consider the larger context within which these sites are located. And because many of these sites are being impacted because of the developments that may happen in the larger context. And not only these new developments, but also the social, economic, institutional, and environmental context of these sites, which is beyond the boundaries of these sites, have to be always taken into consideration. So what does this imply? It implies that we need to recognize the linkage of the values of the site with the wider context. And because a lot of the values are actually uh, are getting their positioning because of the way they are located within the larger territory. The second important aspect is to always think about multi-hazard approach. So we can't just think about only floods or fires or earthquake or urbanization or tourism development in isolation, but we need to consider how they influence each other. So our strategies have to keep always this important element in mind. It also implies that we should address risks to heritage site due to developments in the wider context. As I was just showing you through examples, if we create a dam in an area, larger region, it may have an impact on the heritage site directly or indirectly. And so we need to think about territorial planning as well. Also, it is important to think of how heritage actually can, or the larger territory can provide ecosystem services and socio-economic and public health benefits to people that in fact contribute towards risk reduction without compromising the values. So by destroying the local water systems or the local ecology, we actually in fact negatively affect not only heritage but also the well-being of the people, and that also has to be taken into account. And lastly, we need to work across multiple jurisdictions and geographic boundaries, because We can't just focus on the boundary of the heritage site under consideration, or the cultural agency, heritage agency, which is responsible for it, because it alone will not be able to address these issues. There has to be a link with other jurisdictions, other departments, sectors, and because coordination, synergy, and coherence among policies is the key for making really sustainable development, which not only protects heritage but also helps to make sure that people's lives are secured, and their livelihoods are secured by reducing disaster risks in the short term and in the long term as well. Thank you very much.